recently made a video talking about how modern parenting is failing, and a lot of it in the video, I was talking about the lack of discipline, the lack of accountability that we're applying today. And I'm just curious of your insight. You know, I think we got a lot of people that ruffled feathers because I was talking about how discipline plays such an important part of parenting. And I don't mean discipline in aggressive hitting and punishment. I mean just creating boundaries for children. I feel like today there's so many open boundaries, and it becomes more and more challenging. Just sitting in church, going to out to dinner. There's just not a lot of connectivity anymore, and it seems to be a really big challenge. I'd love to get your insight on that.
So the first edition of my book, The Collapse of Parenting, was published way back in 2015, and the publisher invited me to write a new edition, which was just published. In the new edition, I talk about this phenomenon of gentle parenting, which really was not a thing 10 years ago, but it's become quite popular. So the new edition opens with a story from my own practice. I'm a family doctor. And mom brings her daughter into the office, and mom explains her daughter is sick and she has a fever and a sore throat. And so after mom has explained this, I say, okay, time to take a look. Would you please open your mouth and say, this girl's 6 years old? And daughter shakes her head, no. And I say, okay, mom, looks like I'm going to need your help here. Would you please ask your daughter to open wide and say, ah? And mom says, her body, her choice. Okay, so my body, my choice, longtime slogan of abortion rights activists, and more recently adopted by activists opposed to COVID vaccines. Mom is using that slogan to defend her daughter's refusal to allow me, the examining physician, to look in her throat. Look, in order for parenting to work, parents have to have authority. Uh, we can argue about what gentle parenting means, and different gurus have different definitions. But one thing they agree on is that gentle parenting means letting kids decide. That good parenting means letting kids decide. Well, good parenting doesn't mean letting kids decide. That's basically a really bad idea. Uh, and that's not a guess. We've got lots of good research on this, and I present that research in the new edition. Uh, Good parenting requires parents to teach their kids right and wrong. Look, children are developing for more years than most animals live. A 4-year-old child has barely begun. A 4-year-old horse is a mature adult, and a horse is a bigger animal than a human. So development is not primarily about biological maturity, because horses get it done in 4 years. The Kentucky Derby is raced with 3-year-olds. Humans, as I said, are developing for more years than most animals live. Why? Why does it take so long? Well, we don't have to guess. We have scholars like Dr. Melvin Konner at Emory, who's devoted his career to studying this question, comparing development in our species with development in other animals. He wrote this 800-page tome called The Evolution of Childhood, Oxford University Press, comparing development in our species with development in other animals, especially other primates. Why does it take so many years? And the answers the scholars give is that it takes so many years because it takes many years for parents to teach their child right and wrong. But teaching your child right and wrong requires that you teach from a position of authority. If you're talking to your kid about not cheating on a test and you say, I personally, I don't think I would cheat because that's just not my thing. But hey, you do you, whatever floats your boat. You're not teaching anything. In order to teach right and wrong, you have to teach from a position of authority. But when you abandon that authority, when you adopt the perspective of gentle parenting, that good parenting means letting kids decide, then you have set your child adrift. And if they live in the United States and they have a device with internet access, so I quote an op-ed published by a longtime columnist for the New York Times, Jennifer Finney Boylan, in which she wrote a column about enlightened parenting, in which she asserted, and I quote, enlightened parenting means setting your child free to discover for themselves their own right and wrong. And if in so doing your child becomes a stranger to you, then so be it. End quote. That's enlightened parenting, according to the New York Times. Well, if you follow that advice, which is a good summary of gentle parenting, set your child free to discover their own right and wrong. And if your child becomes a stranger to you, then so be it. That's Jennifer Finney Boylan. That's the New York Times. Well, if you set your child free and they have a device with internet access, what they will discover is SZA, is Bruno Mars, is Drake, is mainstream pornography. It's a very toxic culture full of profanity and sleaze. And this is incidentally a major factor that is driving this collapse of parenting is this culture of disrespect and sleaze. Uh, and it is a toxic culture. And this is not a guess. It is not a guess. You know, Jonathan Haidt has enjoyed enormous success with his book, The Anxious Generation, published 1 year ago, March of 2024. Still a huge bestseller right now as we speak. And one of the big questions he claims to answer in the book is why has there been this enormous rise in anxiety and depression among American kids over the last 15 years? And he asserts it's because of screens. Social media and smartphones are driving this rise in anxiety and depression. He says we got to lock down the phones and lock down the social media. One thing he doesn't address or even mention in his book is that this rise in anxiety and depression that is so prevalent in the United States and in Canada and in the United Kingdom and in Australia is not observed, for the most part, outside of the English speaking world. It's not observed in Spain. It's not observed in Greece. It's not observed in Russia. He never mentions this in the book. But kids in Greece and Russia are just as likely to have smartphones and just as likely to have social media as kids in the United States. We know this. And I have argued recently, and in my book, the new edition of my book, The Collapse of Parenting, that the smartphones and the social media are vectors, but not causes. Now, those terms, that term vector is borrowed from medicine. I'm a medical doctor. The Anopheles mosquito is the vector of malaria. It spreads malaria, but it's not the cause of malaria.
Right.
The cause of malaria is a microorganism, a parasite called Plasmodium falciparum. You can only see it with a microscope. The mosquito is the vector. It spreads the microorganism, but it's not the cause. The cause is the parasite. The smartphones and the social media are the vectors. They spread the disease. But the smartphones and the social media are not the cause. The cause is this toxic American culture of disrespect and sleaze. And kids in Greece and Russia aren't becoming depressed, aren't becoming anxious because they're not exposed to the toxic culture. This is something that John Haidt is largely not aware of, but it's something parents need to understand. It's not enough to take away the smartphones and the social media. You also have to offer something positive. You have to offer a healthy culture, something positive to replace Drake and SZA and Cardi B and Megan the Stallion. You have to offer something positive in its place. And I'm very proud to say that my daughter, Sarah, can sing Bruce Springsteen's Born to Run, can sing all the lyrics to The Bandwagon, the MGM musical. And she has started a small, well, actually not that small, group of kids at her high school who know all these songs as well. There's a lot of good stuff in American popular culture. And you share that with your kid and you celebrate it together. A lot of the stuff right now in American popular culture is pretty bad, but you find the good stuff and you share it with your kid.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I couldn't agree more, and it's very challenging. You know, my wife and I'll go to church on a Sunday, and we watch the total disruption. Now, keep in mind, we had young kids, and we know that young children have moments where they have to express themselves. They have to be taken out of the service or whatever it may be. But we're not talking about young children. We're talking about kids that are 4, 5, 6, 7 years old. They're eating snacks. They're walking around. They're talking in full volume voices. Like zero level of respect has been taught, even in an environment like that, which is mind boggling to me. You know, to the point where you're sitting there and you're like, both of us are looking at each other like, we do the little hand grab or something. We're like, we're trying not to be judgmental as we're in a place where we're trying to get better as faithful humans. But it is very frustrating from a parenting perspective. And I watch my boys watch this type of thing and it frustrates them because we've brought them up in a way where they understand accountability, where they understand success and respect. And they've also played a lot of team sports, which I think is very valuable because they've also learned accountability to other people, they've learned discipline in other ways, and it's now reciprocal in their lives in so many other patterns and necessary instances. So, I look at these things and I think everybody seems to want. I had somebody tell me that they wanted they my boys are great. They're respectful, they're great young men. I love everything about them and how they are being raised. And I remember having this conversation where I said, "Yes, but you can't get to this without having these foundational things that go with it, which building a foundation of respect and accountability and discipline. These are boundaries that kids need." And how do we get people to start? I mean, you've obviously not only released this book and information once, but now you've re-released it and updated it so that you can help the next generation. What are the steps that we take? What are the things that we do to help bring this next generation into a place of respect and accountability and discipline again, where kids are going to survive and be more successful?
Well, I share your concern about some of the parents. And uh, as I tell parents, you cannot teach a virtue which you do not possess. And when I visit schools, very often the format is a morning meeting with the students, afternoon workshop for teachers, and evening presentation to parents. Uh, and I was at a school in Maryland, and I was at a middle school, and I was saying to the students, I was saying, all right, so this evening I'm going to meet with some of your parents, and I'm going to tell them to lock down social media. I'm going to share with them some parental monitoring apps, and I'm going to tell them no social media, and that's because social media is toxic. So no social media. And when I meet with the students, I always question and answer. I always encourage the kids to raise their hands, and I will call on them. And a boy raised his hand, and I called on him, and he said, "Can you tell me how to install that app on my mom's phone?" And he then proceeded to tell the entire middle school how he comes home and he's trying to have a conversation with his mom. And his mom is not looking at him. His mom is looking, scrolling through her Instagram, tapping on her Instagram, giving distracted one word answers, really not paying attention to her son as she's looking at her social media. And it just broke my heart that here this boy is telling the entire middle school that his mom would rather look at her Instagram than talk to her son. How is she supposed to teach him anything? Well, she's not. And I hear those stories a fair bit. That's not a unique story, and it's just heartbreaking that the parents that's also part of what I mean by the collapse of parenting. That something that I'm observing that some parents are not doing their jobs, that they cannot teach virtue to their kids because they don't have the virtue that they need to teach. You cannot teach a virtue which you do not possess. In order to become a better parent, you have to become a better person. So I'm trying to inspire and motivate parents. You can change. You can become a better parent.
If you like clips like this, I have a similar clip here. And if you want to watch the full video, click here.